right, the first topic we're going to cover today are three terms we should hear a lot of in this class. The terms liberal democracies, illiberal democracy, and authoritarian regimes. And these are essentially categorizations of governments based on the amount of political freedom that exists within the country. So we're just going to get kind of broad strokes on these three terms. So the first one is liberal democracy, and we have 6 countries that we talk about in this class, and only one of them is considered to be a liberal democracy. So you see the word liberal in there. Liberal means different things in this class than it does in a class on American politics. Essentially, liberal means open in the context of this definition. So liberal democracies are open democracies and have the following characteristics. So liberal democracies have the consent of the governed and well-established rule of law, which is a term we talked about. I see that one says rule, but rule of law. Let me change that. All right, rule of law. Clear separation of powers or safeguards to protect against democratic erosion. So either they have a system that looks sort of like the United States, where you have a separate judicial, executive, and legislative branch, and checks and balances across those different branches, or you have some sort of pretty well-established norms or safeguards that exist within the political system to protect against one faction of government or one part of government gaining too much power. The next one is probably the most important, and I always tell students, when in doubt, if you're thinking about liberal democracies, authoritarian regimes, illiberal democracies, ask yourself the question, does this country hold free and fair elections? And if the answer is yes, you are probably thinking about a liberal democracy. So that's a good one to think about. Free and fair elections are free from state influence or control over the media, and political decision-making takes place through some sort of transparent means and not through the arbitrary decisions of one or by a sort of cadre of individuals. That there is an openness to the government and a transparency that exists, but kind of goes hand in hand with having a media that is free. So there's only one country in this course that fits those criteria, and it's the United Kingdom. And if we look across the world, the countries are in green. This is the Freedom House map of kind of political freedom across the world. And green means free, yellow means partially free, and purple means not free. So they roughly kind of correspond to our categories. So the green countries are countries that I would consider to be mostly liberal democracies, although we'll get to some of the weirdness of this category in the next category. So you can see the United Kingdom here, as well as other countries in the world that are considered to be liberal democracies. All right, so the next category is probably a term you haven't heard as much, illiberal democracy. So it is not necessarily the opposite of a liberal democracy, but essentially it is a system of government that has characteristics of liberal democracy, and they hold elections, and the elections themselves are generally free-ish, and could result in the transition of power between different groups of people within the country or different political factions within the countries. But they still have some pretty serious limitations, and some pretty serious things that prevent there from being the same level of openness that we see in liberal democracies. So those things could be something like political corruption, where essentially that serves to sort of undermine the legitimacy of the government in the eyes of citizens. Non-state violence that exists within the country. So parts of the country are maybe not under control of the government, or there's sort of a lack of state sovereignty or state control over different parts of the country. The elections themselves could be riddled with, if not sort of corruption, at the very least, not have certain sort of methodology that would exist in a more developed country or a more developed democracy. Or it can sort of have an authoritarian leader that gets control of a democracy and then just sort of rattles around and wrecks some of the political institutions intentionally to benefit themselves, which we've started to see across the world. And kind of looking at different countries in the maps, we'll talk about that. So the term illiberal democracy kind of corresponds with Mexico and Nigeria in our course. And I would say the things that make kind of this categorization apt for these two countries are the first two bullet points. So political corruption is a really, really serious problem in both Mexico and Nigeria. It is probably the number one or number two problem in both of those countries. Next to, in Nigeria, kind of the non-state violence that takes place within the country, some of the threats to state sovereignty that exist in northern Nigeria. So political corruption serves to undermine democracy in both of those countries. And interestingly, both of those countries have sort of moved towards having more free and fair elections. So they are young democracies. They have both only been democracies about 20 years. And essentially, they've sort of moved in a more developed or more, they've moved towards liberal democracy more. But essentially, they have really, really big kind of things that check the ability their ability to be representative to citizens. And in Mexico, the drug war and political kind of gangs that exist and interact with the political system, and really not political gangs, but gangs that exist, drug gangs that exist and interact with the political system in really interesting ways, also serves to undermine the legitimacy of their government. And then there's another term called hybrid regimes. This is not quite as used as often. Essentially, this term means kind of a country that contains some characteristics of liberal democracy and some characteristics of an authoritarian regime. So you'll still see some stuff that is with this class that refers to Russia as a hybrid regime. I think Russia is probably more close to the authoritarian regime category at this point. It's just evolved throughout the course of this class to where I think that's a more representative term, but I do want to at least mention that. So the countries in yellow are some of the countries that I would categorize as illiberal democracies. So you can see Nigeria here and Mexico, and also some of the other world's most important democracies like the Philippines, Indonesia. I think you're seeing a couple of countries that will be yellow soon. Brazil and India are having, I would categorize them as illiberal democracies as well. Essentially, you're starting to see the leaders within those countries have a significant impact on the openness and the effectiveness of their democracy. So you're starting to see that occur in other countries throughout the world too. And the last term is authoritarian regime. So the proxy question we talk about, does it hold free and fair elections? So the answer for authoritarian regimes are no. They still might hold elections. So there's some interesting stuff that with elections and authoritarian regimes, and it's not all, like North Korea and or Stalin and the USSR. There's a lot of interesting nuances that exist within authoritarian regimes. And because 3 of the 6 countries that we talk about are authoritarian regimes, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the term and a lot of time talking about the different types of authoritarian regimes. So it's probably what we spend the most amount of time talking about in this class, because we have essentially half the countries that fall into the category. So authoritarian regimes can differ. So China has essentially a one-party state where the Communist Party is in charge of the country. And we will learn all about the interesting ways in which the Communist Party and the government have parallel institutions kind of at each level, the way that the party controls the organs of the state in a really interesting way. It can be what you're reading that you want to read about, personalist autocrats like Russia and Vladimir Putin, where you essentially have a leader that's turned the workings of the state sort of toward them, and has the country sort of set up in a way in which the president is kind of squashing all the other parts of the government that could possibly challenge them. And then some other versions. And then the third one that covers a country that we talk about is Iran, where it's probably an oversimplification to just use the term theocracy, because it's a little bit more complicated than that, because Iran has religious institutions and they have kind of basically government institutions, and the religious institutions essentially check the government institutions. So that is theocracy, I guess, but it's, it's a very complicated theocracy, and I don't know, it's a little bit more complicated than just using the word theocracy to me. And then some other types that military regimes. So you see a lot of juntas and a lot of kind of military regimes that exist in Nigeria's past. And then the other term that they use in the course outline is totalitarian. So this refers to essentially a regime where there's almost no political freedom at all. So the USSR under Stalin is a good example. North Korea today, where there's a significant amount of state violence against their own citizens, and that state violence is even kind of more arbitrary than in an authoritarian regime. So Iran, Russia, and China would be classified as authoritarian regimes for R3. And you can see the purple countries are the other countries that I would put in that category as well. All right, thanks.